the third session of our virtual All USA meeting 2021, and it's been inspiring to hear news from Oroville, as we did last night, from Renu and Charlie, and then to hear about the Swadharma program that Oroville is running, giving people some sense of tools and ways to understand their path forward, their calling, and it seems so important these days. And I'm so grateful that Martha Orton, who's an author, who's been involved both with the ashram and Oroville, and has made a deep study of Sri Aurobindo's philosophy and the Mother's teachings, can share with us for an hour this morning. So Martha, welcome. And those of you who want to pin Martha, if you mouse over her screen, you can do that. And if you go to the three dots, you can also see that you can change your layout if you want to look at the other people. And Martha, thank you.
Thank you very much, Julian. I'm going to be focusing in my talk on the concept of offering and its role in the integral yoga. And I'm going to be basing this on several essays that have been published just before the pandemic in a book published by Sakai. So to begin, remembering and offering, the brief phrase given us by the Mother, advising us to remember and offer, can be regarded as a core practice of the integral yoga. Although there's no system as such to be followed in pursuing the path of the integral yoga of Sri Aurobindo and the Mother, there are certain elements that stand out in their teachings and which serve as specific guides along the way. Several of these are the practices of aspiration, rejection, and surrender, which Sri Aurobindo explains in his small but wonderfully powerful and profound little book, The Mother. Aspiration can begin as an expression of the innate urge to connect with the divine. This is actually inherent in our being because of the psychic being, the spark of the divine, which is present at the innermost center of each of us. Interestingly, the Mother has also explained that our psychic openness can be linked to or especially accessed by our personal individual interests and enthusiasms, as well as by feelings of gratitude. Rejection means turning away from all that doesn't lead to our goal, all that is inconsistent with our aspiration, not asceticism, but rather a process of purification in this specific sense. For example, there are aspects of popular culture which we may find we need to distance ourselves from in order to follow our aspiration. We may find that these not only are unhelpful, but we may also discover that they run counter to our personal goals and actually pose obstacles. We can become aware of the aspects of our environmental consciousness also. Of course, aspects of popular culture are part of that. The effects of the milieu in which we find ourselves. We need to consciously filter out the influences which we find incompatible for our aspiration and our goal. Then we come to surrender. Surrender is our willingness to give up our personal will, our ego, and follow what the divine wills for us in our life. The practice of offering, sacrificing to the divine, is a prelude to the complete surrender of our will, our entire being, to the divine. Sri Aurobindo writes of offering most frequently using the term sacrifice. As a scholar of the classics, he was very conscious of the literal and root meanings of words deriving from Latin and Greek. So it's appropriate for us to understand that Sri Aurobindo used the word sacrifice in its original sense, to make sacred. So I would like to explore the practice of offering, of sacrifice, further in my talk today. Sri Aurobindo describes the concept of sacrifice as a dynamic process central to the integral yoga, writing extensively on this concept and giving it particular emphasis in several chapters of the Synthesis of Yoga. Sri Aurobindo describes two major forms of sacrifice that occur in the universe. The first of these is the sacrifice made by the divine through the descent of the Purusha from the vast oneness into the world and matter. This is the divine itself coming into the world as matter and imbuing the world itself with the divine presence and reality, resulting in all the manifestation being imbued with divinity, as explained in the concept of Brahman, the divine in all in the divine, all as the divine, and also the divine present in human form as the avatar, coming throughout the ages to help humanity in its evolution. As Sri Aurobindo has written in The Mother, this is the great sacrifice, sometimes called the sacrifice of the Purusha, but much more deeply the Holocaust of Prakriti, the sacrifice of the Divine Mother. This sacrifice, the highest and greatest, precedes the second made by the manifestation to the divine. The sacrifice made by the divine in coming into matter initiates and enables the sacrifice which the manifestation can make to the divine. Sri Aurobindo states, this descent, the sacrifice of the Purusha, the divine soul submitting itself to force and matter so that it may inform and illuminate them, is the seed of redemption of this world of inconscience and ignorance. The second form of sacrifice is that made by the manifest existence in its unconscious or conscious growth towards the divine. This is the one in which we can actively and consciously participate. This sacrifice leads human beings on the Triune Path of Yoga, in which the paths of works, knowledge, and devotion merge, and ultimately to union with the divine. In Sri Aurobindo's view, the sacrifice on the part of humanity is ongoing and inevitable as human beings interact with all around us. Through our lives and interaction, we can give various capacities of ourselves and in exchange receive from our surroundings. He describes the purpose underlying this action, for it is only by this giving and receiving that it can affect its own growth, while at the same time it helps the sum of things. So we are dependent on this interchange. So this is a process characterized by expansion and dynamism. In addition, Sri Aurobindo addresses both the level of awareness and the spirit in which sacrifice is made. He observes that egoistic or unconscious sacrifice leads to only limited reward, whereas conscious sacrifice offered with love for and commitment to the divine leads to true joy and fulfillment. The underlying purpose of conscious sacrifice, true self-offering, is expressed in his statement, all true love and all sacrifice are in their essence nature's contradiction of the primary egoism and its separative error. It is her attempt to turn from a necessary first fragmentation towards a recovered oneness. While sacrifice on the part of humanity is integral to its nature and its purpose of existence, the return for the sacrifice is also assured, naturally present, and expressed through the divine descent. The Purusha has descended upon earth, awakening earth's awareness and igniting its offering to the divine, and it both responds to and fulfills the ultimate purpose of the sacrifice. So I'll quote Sri Aurobindo again. Our sacrifice is not a giving without any return or any fruitful acceptance from the other side. It is an interchange between the embodied soul and conscious nature in us and the eternal spirit. For even though no return is demanded, yet there is the knowledge deep within us that a marvelous return is inevitable. The soul knows that if it does not give itself to God, it knows that it does not give itself to God in vain, claiming nothing. It yet receives the infinite riches of the divine power and presence. It is inspiring to understand that any and all sacrifice, conscious or unconscious, fully sincere, or even mixed or partial in its nature, has the potential to lead ultimately to the goal of unity with the divine, the true purpose of man's life upon earth. Even sacrifices offered to others or to any aspect of the divine become offerings to the one divine presence because of its true and complete omnipresence. Sri Aurobindo writes of a progression from involuntary to voluntary offering, concomitant with the growth of consciousness. Once the offering becomes voluntary, spiritual growth both deepens and accelerates, even if done mentally in a superficial and mechanical way, for this creates a conscious connection with the divine. Sri Aurobindo explains the importance of offering all aspects of life and action, the mundane and ordinary, as well as one's inner aspirations and higher thoughts and deeds. He states that doing so enables the offering to become integral and complete as one grows in devotion and intimacy with the divine. It assists in the realization that not only is all contained within the divine, but also that the divine is in all and the divine is all. When offering becomes full and integral, an offering of all one's thoughts, feelings, aspirations, and actions, a true and sincere sacrifice of all the parts of the being, it leads to identification with and union with the divine. Sri Aurobindo also emphasizes that only a supreme self-abandonment attains to the supreme. There are three important results of the practice of sacrifice, of offering. I think we need to keep that word in mind because it doesn't mean deprivation of self or any torturing of ourselves or punishment in the sense in which it's often understood. So Sri Aurobindo details three results of the practice of sacrifice, of offering. The first of these is devotion for the divine, which can be cultivated and developed through the discipline of offering. Sri Aurobindo states that even self-offering without devotion leads ultimately to true devotion. This is so because the offering of one's actions develops an ongoing connection with the divine that grows in closeness and intimacy. Ultimately, this relationship deepens and grows into a profound love for the divine, thus becoming the yoga of love as well as the yoga of works. Excuse me. The second result is the development of knowledge of the truth of existence, which Sri Aurobindo describes in part as follows. Next, the practice of this yoga demands a constant inward remembrance of the one central liberating knowledge, and a constant active externalizing of it in works comes in too to intensify the remembrance. In all is the one self. The one divine is all. All are in the divine. All are the divine. And there is nothing else in the universe. This thought or this faith is the whole background until it becomes the whole substance of the consciousness of the worker. This intense, all-encompassing awareness of the divine leads to a knowledge beyond ordinary human perception and mental capacity. As Sri Aurobindo states, in its close, if not long before it, this way of works turns by communion with the divine presence, will, and force into a way of knowledge more complete and integral than any the mere creature intelligence can construct, or the search of the intellect can discover. It is important to note that this result of the sacrifice, knowledge, combines with human action and works to fulfill its role in the yoga. It is not a static knowledge, but a knowledge integrated into life and existence. For Sri Aurobindo, real knowledge is the knowledge of spiritual realization. So I would note that before going on. The complete consecration of one's being, heart, mind, will, and actions to the divine, and abandonment of egoism is the third result of the practice of sacrifice. All sense of a separate self must be dissolved. One must live only for the divine. Accordingly, all action is done in the service of the divine, for the love of the divine, and as a selfless offering to the divine alone. Sri Aurobindo states, in this way of doing and seeing, all works and all life become only a daily dynamic worship and service of the divine in the unbounded temple of his own vast cosmic existence. Abandoning the ego and directing oneself fully towards the divine merges into the sacrifice of work, as one uses work as a field for sacrifice and the progressive surrender of one's ego. It also merges into the development of devotion, as one grows in love through the selfless, egoless offering of work. Finally, it joins with the development of knowledge, as one grows in the realization that the divine is all, and all is the divine, and that the divine is in truth both the recipient and doer of the sacrifice, the recipient and the giver of the offering. In their combined action, the three results of sacrifice, of offering, love for the divine, knowledge of the divine, consecration of the entire being to the divine, come together to form the Triune Path. This is a path of yoga based on work as an offering to the divine, infused with the power of love and devotion, and informed and enriched by the power of knowledge. In this threefold path, the three aspects merge, support, and become one in their progress. The Triune Path ultimately leads to the true goal of existence, union with the divine. Therefore, Sri Aurobindo's use of the term sacrifice is fully in harmony with its original and literal meaning, which is to make holy, to make divine. In describing the elements of sacrifice, Sri Aurobindo does so with detail, richness, and depth that go beyond the mere conveying of definition, information, and description. He conveys, as much as possible through words, the various experiences involved in sacrifice and their results. In this way, his writing resonates with a vibrant sense of challenge and opportunity for those aspiring to follow the triune path of integral yoga. In his famous and oft-quoted statement, "All life is yoga," Sri Aurobindo sums up the essence of his conceptualization of the integral yoga and also gives us a clear link to the meaning and significance of the mother's advice to remember and offer. This is so because of the nature of offering and the significance which Sri Aurobindo attaches to it as inherent in the practice of the yoga. In describing the triune path of the integral yoga, Sri Aurobindo explains with vivid richness how the paths of knowledge, works, and devotion merge and become one. One can start at any of these points of approach and incorporate all the other aspects of yogic practice along the way to the goal of union with the divine, and also realize the fullness of all of them in that union. Since Sri Aurobindo, in his comprehensive unitary vision of Brahman, regards the divine as constituting all that is, everything that exists, and also regards all of this to be divine, he does not support dividing the world into the divine and undivine, the usual distinction between the holy and the worldly, sacred and profane. Moreover, in his conceptualization of the evolution of consciousness, his vision of the progressive revelation of the inherent divine in life, matter, and the world, Sri Aurobindo explains that the divinity within the manifestation will not permit its suppression forever and will inevitably express itself, doing so with transforming effect. We human beings, in our self-awareness, have the ability to cooperate consciously with the expression and manifestation of divinity, initially doing so in our aspiration to develop ourselves in whatever aspect of our nature seems most important to us. As consciousness increases, so does the aspiration for development, ultimately leading to spiritual aspiration for inner growth and realization. We see this aspiration expressed in all the mystic traditions and can also recognize it in many forms in human life in general. The psychologist Abraham Maslow has written extensively of the progression of human development and included spiritual aspiration as being at the peak of human experience. The aspiration for spiritual growth is often spontaneously expressed by the urge to remember the divine and offer whatever we do. It is surely an essential aspect of the integral yoga. Inherent in this process is the development of a progressively closer relationship with the divine. In essence, this becomes a reciprocal process of offering and grace. However, it must be noted that the divine grace does not depend on any human action. Divine grace simply is. The importance of this simple, though profound process has been expressed by one of the long-term sadhaks of the ashram in Pandi, Udar Pinto, who has told a story in which the mother explained to him that he was not doing the yoga entirely correctly. Udar explained this to Ani Nanali, who many of you may remember with fond affection. He writes that the mother told him he should brush his teeth with her. That is, he should keep her in his consciousness always, even in the simplest and most mundane acts. In making this somewhat surprising assertion, the mother was pointing out vividly that the pursuit of spiritual growth does not depend on great experiences or holy observances, but also develops from a gradual and constant practice of remembrance, aspiration, and offering. All life is yoga in Sri Aurobindo's conception, and inherently so. In my personal life, I have found that remembering and offering greatly eases my heart in times of trouble. The act of reminding myself to do this has also become less necessary over time, but reminding seems to be needed more often for common, ordinary circumstances. It is usual for a person to simply go about the day more directed by personal volition, in a sense being directed by the requirements of external circumstances, individual ego, and personal wants. I think this is pretty much the default mode for human nature. But when we engage on a spiritual path, the potential for change is greatly increased. We are aspiring to improve upon our usual human nature. This can include offering ourselves to the will of the divine, surrendering our will to the divine's will as part of the process of offering our daily actions. Doing so consequently deepens our offering and constitutes a step beyond offering our problems for the divine to solve for us. In offering our problems in times of crisis, we are not only acting in our own self-interest, but we're also acknowledging that we need help, that our personal human capacities are not sufficient to manage all that needs to be managed in our lives. In asking for our help, we recognize the presence of the divine and our dependence on him. Now, we may be reluctant to recognize the significance of personal crises in developing our relationship and connection with the divine, and feel, as a friend of mine once said, "Oh no, not another darn growth experience." However grudgingly our involuntary acquiescence may be, we usually do see the potential for growth in such times. even though we don't like to admit it. In remembering the reality of the divine in whatever form or degree of personal relationship we conceive, we develop an increasingly conscious and active awareness of the presence of the divine in our lives. With this remembrance, and even more so with offering our actions, what we do in life and how we go about our actions, how we spend our days, these are increasingly influenced and molded by this process. Increasingly, our behavior, thought processes, and decisions come under the influence of our sense of the divine's presence. In this manner, we become ever more under the influence of the divine and ever more surrendered to the will of the divine. Altogether, we progress in closeness and advance in our individual spiritual aspiration and evolution. The divine grace is a constant reality and a constant presence, regardless of our conscious engagement with it. In the practice of the integral yoga, truly integrating this awareness into daily life is much enabled by remembering the presence of the divine and offering even our smallest and most mundane actions and hopes. In doing so, we discover even more fully the truth of Sri Aurobindo's assertion that all life is yoga. So what about how this affects our problems and coping with the stresses in our lives? Faith and spiritual practice have great power in solving problems of human life, including the various psychological miseries to which we succumb. Among these, anxiety is a common source of distress. Most people carry around with them on a daily basis specific worries about a number of details and aspects of their lives. Many actually suffer from generalized anxiety, finding that their worries are multiple and unceasing, and that once they get rid of one anxiety, each one is repeatedly replaced by another. For those who have faith in a higher power and a religious or spiritual direction in their lives, offering these worries and anxieties to the divine is a source of comfort, which goes beyond any received from human sources. As we have seen in the integral yoga of Sri Aurobindo and the Mother, offering to the divine is an essential part of the practice. Sri Aurobindo explains that it is through offering to the divine that we become closer to him, and it is also through offering that the dynamic action and processes of our spiritual progress become integral, affecting every aspect and part of our being. We can come to the understanding that if we do this, we will progress spiritually in every way and become more of what we aspire to be. Naturally, we would expect that in the process of offering, and with the faith involved in being motivated to do this in the first place, we would be offering our anxieties about our lives, along with our attempt to offer progressively all that we are and do. In effect, we would be handing all our worries over to the divine. If we do this fully and sincerely, then all our problems should be solved. In full faith, we would see the outcome of any situation as the divine's will in our lives, while not suspending our own efforts to achieve the ends we hope or aspire for. We would nevertheless accept the results with equanimity. But how well do we do this? Even trying hard, we can fail. We need to recognize that the process of offering all to the divine and surrendering our lives to him is a progressive movement. In short, the more one attempts to do this, the more the entire movement develops within the being. We can accept the principles involved at the mental level and still not be able to be as effective as this as we believe we should be. Believing and knowing needs to become complete and fully integral for us to face life with real equanimity. As we aspire to offer fully and have complete faith and trust in the divine, and still find ourselves sinking into anxiety, This unhappiness may be compounded by the guilt we feel in not trusting fully in the divine. We may worry that this is a flaw or weakness in our character. Sri Aurobindo has explained to us that human beings cannot be blamed for being imperfect, that we have been created as expressions of all kinds of personalities and possibilities of being. In effect, we are each of us problems to be solved. This is our job assignment, the task of each of our lives. Moreover, we are subject to the forces of nature, which comprise the various aspects of the human being. Each of us has his or her own version of this, which we need to confront and work through. As we are subject to much that is embedded in us in the subconscious level, the results of past experience, including traumas, also atavism from the cultural environment, and inherited traits, among other elements. Working through these is the task of a lifetime, or more, perhaps more lifetimes. In any case, our task is to try to become increasingly conscious of the various elements of our being and work on ourselves and our natures, aspiring for change. We can progress more effectively if instead of focusing on self-blame for weaknesses and failings, we confront these honestly, acknowledging the various aspects and qualities of our particular nature to the extent we are conscious of them, and focus on the change we aspire to achieving, offering all to the divine. We can take the attitude that this is my work, this is the task which the divine has given to me. He has created me like this, to represent these particular human qualities. My responsibility, my job in this lifetime, is to become conscious of my nature, my strengths as well as weaknesses, aspiring and striving for progress towards perfection, and offering all of myself and my efforts to the divine. Offering is indispensable to this entire process. To the extent that we sincerely offer and surrender ourselves, the divine takes up our lives and our work. All that we are and do becomes more fully and truly His. We progressively experience the grace and leave behind ego and its burdens, including anxiety associated with the sense of ourselves as the doer rather than the divine. We do not only have a significant array of obstacles to our spiritual progress and transformation, but fortunately we have a significant array of strengths in the positive qualities each of us has been given by the divine. The source of these positive qualities and their real strength is the psychic being, the soul, the inner spark of the divine. This makes everything possible. The psychic being is the divine innate within us. It is a gift to us from our Creator. Quietly it drives us forward through lifetimes. When fully formed and fully awakened, it determines everything in one's life, enabling one to live completely for the divine, completely offering one's life and action, and living completely in that light. This psychic transformation is the real solution to the problem of anxiety and all of our very human worries. It enables a life of faith and trust. In a profoundly beautiful and also comforting passage in the Mother, Sri Aurobindo explains that with fully sincere faith and surrender, we will have the assurance of the protection of the divine grace. So I'd love to quote from that again. It's so beautiful. Sri Aurobindo writes, "To walk through life armored against all fear, peril, and disaster, only two things are needed, two that go always together: the grace of the Divine Mother, and on your side, an inner state made up of faith, sincerity, and surrender." Thank you. So
Thank
that's
you so much, Martha. That's wonderful to hear that quote. Those of you who might have known Eugene Mickey Finn, who ran the Boston Center, when he would recite that, Sam Spanier from Matagiri said it was like ringing a golden bell. So that passage you ended with, I identify with him, and it was so lovely to hear your talk and to be reminded of his sweetness. Anyone wants to raise their hand, there's a little emblem at the bottom of your screen, and then Martha can call on you and you can unmute and ask a question.
see. I see Gopal Ahira has raised a hand. Gopal, could you please unmute and ask your question or offer discussion? Julian, perhaps you can unmute Gopal.
Yeah, you have to hit the icon at the bottom of your screen on the left that is the microphone emblem, and click on it, and then you can unmute Gopal. I can mute people, but I can't unmute them. Okay, Gopal is here. Go ahead. Nope, still not unmuted. You have to click the microphone at the bottom of your screen. You can also type. There's a chat feature in the lower right-hand corner, and that also is a way to ask a question. Go ahead.
You hear me? Is it? You still hear me?
Yes.
So, thank you very much for your nice way of presenting Sri Aurobindo's the way of sacrifice and offering. And how will you differentiate between sacrifice and offering? Will you tell me?
They're one and the same. Because sacrifice is not, I think sometimes sacrifice is associated with depriving oneself of something. But Sri Aurobindo uses the term very literally in its meaning to make sacred. So traditionally, people have associated sacrifice with perhaps a ritual offering, a formal offering to the divine in sort of the Vedic sense of ritual. But in the way that Sri Aurobindo uses it, he really means for us to offer everything, even our small things. And I think sometimes it's really hard to want to do that, to offer our thoughts about our weaknesses or the ways that we want to improve, because it's hard to admit failings, and it feels a bit selfish sometimes to offer worries and ask the divine to take them from us. But I think Sri Aurobindo really means for us to offer everything, every detail, as in that story that Udar recounted of the mother telling him to brush his teeth with her. Completely remember the presence of the divine, because we need to develop, we lowly human beings really need to develop that intimacy, that closeness with the divine that has such a transforming effect on us. Because through that, if we develop that, we can have that essentially as a filter, which, actually the mother uses a wonderful image of seeing our lives as in a cinema. So we can have that understanding that we can sort of view what we do, what we want to do, all our wants, thoughts, and feelings in relation to that intimacy, to that closeness with the divine. And then we'll know, are we doing something we should do? Are we doing something we should not do? What else should we do in life and action? And how can we best proceed? It's not only life and action, it's all our feeling and our aspiration. So it's a very good question, and I thank you for asking it. So Bahman, you've raised
Thank
that?
you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Martha. I really appreciate the presentation. Maybe in a way, self-offering would be the term that I've heard before, you know, in terms of the whole thing, as you mentioned, self. But my question is about some practical aspects of this. Maybe you can share something on problems or obstacles in this process, because I think for many of us, certainly for me, the idea has been appealing, at least appealing to a part of me. But, you know, most of us have multiple dimensions to our personalities. So there are parts that open and want to do it, and then there are parts that resist. And I don't know, you know, I'm sure you get the picture. And so there's a lot of internal struggle and conflict that arises. I wonder if you have some thoughts about typical things, and I know this is a unique process, so I'm not asking for a cookie cutter, you know, solution for everyone, but are there some kinds of reflections that you can share in terms of how to prepare for this, and how to deal with some obstacles?
Yeah, that's very interesting. I certainly, being made up of so many aspects of personality, or even, as Sri Aurobindo described, sometimes multiple personalities, all within one being with one particular name associated with it. It's a big challenge, of course. So I think we run into trouble most when we worry about what other people think of us. Like when you objectify your expectation of what someone else might think of what you might do, and base actions on that and offering on that, because this sense of propriety, the superego, in a sense, that sort of sits on people's shoulder, and egoism is certainly an obstacle too. So living from within the truth of your being is certainly a challenge for most of us. So I guess that's what I'm talking about there, the challenges of that. For self-offering, and I think it's very good you make that distinction, that's really self-offering. It's not an offering of one's goods, but it's an offering oneself, one's actions and all that. And it's important to start small. I think you have to start small. Start with something. At least I find it helpful when I get into the day to, I worry, I start offering some of my worries. I also offer my love. And then I offer my aspirations for specific things to happen and take place. But if you start with the things that you think are more proper to offer, you know, like offering your love, then it gets easier to offer the things that you might feel some embarrassment in front of the divine to offer, like your performance anxiety, for example, or any other thing, you know, or say you want something in life really badly. This is an example. I think you really want something to happen. You want somebody to like you. You want to get a job. and you want something very sincerely. And then you may be not sure that you should get that, but that's a part of surrendering to the divine's will. But I think it's a part of something that one can offer that aspiration to get that job, to get that house, to get that whatever it is in the material level, and then try to accept the result as the divine's will. But I certainly ego is a great obstacle, and superego, of course, this sense of what other people think of us, or wanting to be liked, or fear of being disliked or rejected, that kind of thing. It's an obstacle to what we really can think and feel and do.
Thanks, Martha.
Vladimir, unmute, go ahead, ask.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Martha.
A little bit louder.
Thank you, Martha, very much for this beautiful overall presentation of self-offering and sacrifice. I was always puzzled by this, by one element in it. When we do offer, we must have already some contact with the divine. And many people think that offering is like just offer to the best you can imagine, or to something what you think is that divine thing. But many times the address of that offering goes through many means, or through many egoistic layers, as it were, layer upon layer. Of course, at the end, as Gita says, all these just paths to one Brahman, yes, and he partakes of all the offerings. But still, this idea to have a contact, to have the purest contact with the divine in order to be able to offer, I think, what do you think? How could we manage that contact first before we make the offering?
Well, it's enabled by the presence. This is a very good question and a very challenging one, really. It's enabled by the presence of the psychic being, of course, which is, within each of us. Yet to come in contact with that is not always an easy thing for people to experience. The mother mentioned something about, and I've mentioned this briefly in passing, but one of the ways that our psychic openness is accessed is through our personal enthusiasms, through what really speaks to us as people, as individuals. For example, some people are very moved by art or very moved by music. So those are inroads to the psychic being. Also, the sense of gratitude. There are people who are, I think Mother says they're just born this way. They can be very simple too, just born with a sense of gratitude, who just have an openness and appreciation for all that they receive in life. They just are like that, and it's a great blessing to have that sense of gratitude. That makes an automatic connection with the divine. But Sri Aurobindo writes in the synthesis that even a mechanical offering, like even if you just start it at the intellectual level, just mentally, just purely mentally, you say, I offer this, I offer that of myself or my action or my day. It's naturally transformed into a deeper connection and more meaningful and more sincere one. It's just the idea that it's necessary to start with the idea, and then it grows. It is a progressive action.
Thank you.
Any discussion? We don't have to just have questions. If anyone has something to say, I'd love to hear it.
There was one vision of how Gita presents it, as Krishna says, to whom you offer, there you go, basically. To whom you sacrifice, there you go. If you sacrifice to the lower beings, you become like them. You share with them that energy. So basically, we connect to the levels of consciousness and energies which we share with. So offering is the way of sharing the energy or tapping into that particular level of consciousness, as it were. So if you offer to Bhutas, says Krishna, you become like them. If you offer to Pitris, you go to Pitris, to the forefathers. If you offer to the gods, you go to them and share their energies. You become like them. And if you offer to me, to the Supreme, you come to me. You become the Supreme. So this is the way of the sacrifice or the offering, which is tapping into that cloud of energy and consciousness which we want to become.
I'm so glad you shared those thoughts. It relates to the matter of relationship, doesn't it? Who are you going to be in relationship with in your inner life? You have that choice. And if we want to develop an inner relationship with the divine, then we need to offer in that direction.
Could you talk about this collection of essays? Rosemary asks, what book were you reading from, Martha?
All right. It's a collection of essays that's called Sri Aurobindo's Perspective on Reality and Other Essays. And it's available from Shabda in Pondicherry, not yet available through Aramir. It was published just before the pandemic.
So we're actually on the verge of our informal sharing. So I think I'll thank you, Martha, so much for presenting to us today. So clear and correct. I found myself smiling and nodding often. So I'm grateful for your participation in our virtual All USA meeting. I'm going to turn off the recording and invite everyone who would like to update how they are, where they are, and just kind of open things up. If there's feedback and funny sounds, we'll ask people to mute. I think there is a sense that the automatic gain control here is not as